Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Linga-Shannon from the Transnational Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to the fifth webinar in our series on China and the world. The series is being hosted by Transnational Institute and co-sponsored by Gongqiao.org, Made in China Journal, Lausan, Critical China Scholars, and the Asia-Europe People's Forum. The focus of today's webinar will be on China and the world. We have four great speakers lined up for you today. We have Brian Hioe, who is an activist based in Taiwan and an editor of New Bloom magazine. Lee Jones is at Queen Mary University in London and co-author of the forthcoming book, Fractured China: How State Transformation is Shaping China's Rise. Stella Hongjiang is at Johns Hopkins University and co-editor of the People's Map of Global China. And Weldon is at Focus on the Global South and author of China and Imperial Power in the Image of the West. The format of today's session will be two speakers, then we'll have comments from the other panelists and a Q&A, followed by another two speakers and comments and Q&A. There's a lot we could have covered under this topic. China and the world is huge, so we've decided to focus on a few areas in particular. In the first half of the webinar, we'll focus on the Belt and Road Initiative, on Chinese capital and investments. In the second half, we'll focus on Taiwan, the Asia-Pacific region, and geopolitics. You can ask questions at any time through the Q&A tab and add comments or suggestions in the chat. I'm going to be strict with the speakers on timing, so there's plenty of time for us to answer your questions. We'll also show short video clips throughout the webinar, just to give us a different perspective and to liven things up a little. And if you'd like to live tweet through this event, please use the TNI social media hashtag TNI webinars. So our first speaker is Lee Jones. Lee Jones is a professor of political economy and international relations at Queen Mary University of London. His latest book is co-authored with Shahar Hameiri and is called Fractured China: How State Transformations Are Shaping China's Rise. Lee, over to you.
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. So I've been given the kind of unenviable task of giving a quick overview of China's rise internationally and talking about what is driving its behavior. There are obviously many different aspects to China's rise that we can't really go into in any real depth in 10 minutes. One aspect is its military rise, but as you can see from the data here, although China is definitely modernizing and expanding its armed forces, it remains relatively weak compared to the global hegemon, the United States. Despite all the talk about Chinese overseas bases, China only has one compared to the United States, some 800. So China's military rise is largely felt only in its near abroad, in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, and to a lesser extent in Central Asia, rather than as a global phenomenon. It's really China's economic rise that has given, that affects the rest of the world. And this has many different elements. There's obviously trade, which I'm not going to go into at the moment, but certainly we have seen a massive takeoff, explosion in investment into China, but rather unusually for a developing country, China has also become a capital exporter. And it's really the activities of China's state-owned enterprises in particular, in terms of their going out since 2000, they're investing overseas, that has caught the attention, positive and negative, of the rest of the world. It is, though, again, still important to put these figures into perspective. Although China is now a major international investor, it still only comprises 6% of the world's total outbound foreign direct investment stock, and the inbound is also relatively small comparisons there to the United States. Where China has really sort of outpaced the West, the United States, is in terms of its involvement in development financing. You can see here the figures comparing the United States and China over the period 2000 to 2014. And China is just $40 billion behind the United States in its provision of development financing. And this is a mixture of ODA, official development assistance, but also other forms of official financing like trade credits. And in particular, China has really sort of cornered the market in terms of overseas infrastructure projects. The latest data that we have suggests there's nearly 1,000 projects totaling $170 billion over the period 2013-21. And although the United States and other Western powers are moving into this space to try to compete with China, they're moving from an extremely low base and don't really have the resources devoted to combat China in this area. Another big area has been of note has been China's rise as a global lender to foreign governments, and often that lending is given, is arranged in order to fund the infrastructure projects being carried out by China's state-owned enterprises. So it's essentially a form of tied aid, with governments taking on sovereign debt in order to pay for these projects. As we know, the Belt and Road Initiative is actually a commercial venture and not charity. So you will see plenty of charts like those on the left, highlighting a number of countries that are now heavily indebted to China, with lots of talk of a debt trap. I think it's important to put this into perspective. Although China's rise of overall, China's share of overall debt has risen quite substantially, it is still a relatively small part of the overall mix. Multilateral creditors, bilateral creditors, private lenders still have overall in total much larger claim on most governments in the world. So we can see from this focus on a small number of Belt and Road countries, for example, that there are some countries like Laos and Cambodia, for example, that are very heavily indebted to China. As a percentage of their total debt, the debt to China is half or approaching half. But you can also see many other countries where China is a much smaller fraction, and more money is owed to other multilateral development banks or other lenders. So again, we shouldn't, although China's rise in terms of lending is important, we shouldn't exaggerate it. We need to keep it in perspective. Now, what is driving this overseas economic expansion, which is the main way that most people actually experience China's rise? I would argue that it is primarily about market factors, and most of the Chinese enterprises going overseas are essentially profit seeking. And so I do not believe that there is a clear geopolitical strategy driving every, and certainly not even a majority of China's overseas investments. This is because state-owned enterprises in the Chinese system have become corporatized, meaning that they've been turned from parts of Chinese production ministries into independent, relatively autonomous, profit-seeking entities, which are under arm's length and often relatively weak oversight from the party state. And state-owned enterprises have been driven out by a number of different factors at home: dwindling resources, dwindling market opportunities because of market saturation, massive overcapacity in all basic industries due to irrational, exuberant overinvestment because of the decentralized nature of China's economy, and collapsing profitability at home. So all these factors are driving state-owned enterprises into trying to find markets overseas. And the Chinese policy banks, the Export-Import Bank and China Development Bank, have been directed to support this expansion. And that is what has fueled the huge expansion in trade credits in particular, to allow foreign consumers or governments to purchase the goods and services produced by China's state-owned enterprises, to soak up that excess capacity. And commercial banks in China also are seeking profitable outlets for the many hundreds of billions of dollars that have been sucked into the Chinese financial system as a result of China's export-oriented growth and the repression of consumption within China. So what has happened is there's a strong material drive coming from the Chinese economy for going out. And essentially political leaders have sought to put a kind of diplomatic overlay on this. They see a scope for a diplomatic win to gain some kind of political credit from this overseas expansion. And this, I think, is fundamentally the origin of the idea of the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road is not something new. It merely aggregates and scales up existing Chinese overseas economic activities and tries to frame it in terms of China making a positive contribution to global governance and to global development. And of course, it is important to say that there is a real need, or in many cases, perhaps we should frame it as a desire on the part of recipient state elites to draw in Chinese investment into their countries. And so this is then framed as a win-win. China wins because it gets to secure markets and political kudos. The recipient wins because it gets investment in projects that more risk-averse competitors are not willing to back. And it's important to say that this is not driven by a very clear, detailed, coherent strategy, and there is relatively weak coordination and oversight. And this is because, as my new book, Fractured China, points out, that the Chinese party state is a regulatory state rather than a command and control state. It tends to set out broad guidelines, policy ideas, slogans, and so on, not detailed instructions. The whole Chinese political system effectively works in this way, that top leaders set the broad direction of travel, but it is left to other actors nationally, subnationally, to fill in the gaps, to work out what these broad plans are really going to mean in practice. And they can also influence these policy agendas, they can interpret them into concrete activities, and they can even ignore central regulations and guidelines. And so as a consequence, a lot of overseas investment by China, much of the Belt and Road Initiative, is not really strategic. There is no official map or plan. There's no blueprint in Beijing that is being rolled out. And political leaders rarely, if ever, decide where particular investments or projects go. At best, they might give a broad direction to party-state actors to say, we want to strengthen ties with this or that country. But the details of exactly what projects emerge in that context is left to others, the state-owned enterprises that are prospecting for business overseas and local elites in recipient states, who are the ones that have to apply for aid to Beijing. What often happens is that these projects, which emerge in a rather bottom-up and ad hoc way, are then given endorsements or a diplomatic gloss by top leaders, rather than stemming from the agency and insights and ideas of top leaders. What actually happens in practice is relatively weakly governed. There is relatively weak regulatory oversight of state-owned enterprises, although they have attempted to tighten that up over time. And the consequence is that there's ample room within this very broad, flexible framework for lots of self-interested and even nefarious activity, including on the recipient side. So there is a lot of scope for corruption and malfeasance with kickbacks for
I think we've lost Lee there. Can one of the panelists, Jess, am I the only one not hearing Lee?
No, it's cut out.
I can't hear. I don't hear him.
Okay, oh, that's a shame. So we'll hopefully Lee can reconnect quickly. But I think he was nearing the end of his presentation anyway. So while we're waiting for him to reconnect, perhaps we can move to Stella. So Stella, is there anything you'd like to add to what Lee has said there?
Yeah, I think Lee has excellent analysis of the way, the dynamics behind the rise of China's economic outward investment, and a lot of it is driven by the profit-seeking activities of companies, including both state-owned and private companies. And so even the state-owned companies, in terms of their relationship with the Chinese government, is more like arm's length, like what Lee was framing. It's sometimes it's not all. I think only in perhaps exceptional cases where the government was the one that was taking the lead to plan for a certain project and then require and ask the companies to carry it out. I think more commonly the case is that the companies are going to overseas markets and they are seeking out business opportunities, and then they retrofit it into China's overall development strategy and convince the government to fund it. So that's a dynamic, and that's been well recognized in academic research.
Thanks, Stella. Lee, if you're there, we might pop back to you to finish your presentation, if that's possible.
Yeah, sorry about that. I have no idea what happened there, but I don't know when I cut out, because I could still hear you saying that I had disappeared. So
okay. I think we got up to the end of the slide. Was that your last slide?
it is the last slide. So
Okay.
essentially what I'm saying here is that this lack of strategic planning and weak oversight gives lots of room for state-owned enterprises, but also elites in recipient states to bend the Belt and Road Initiative to their own particular interests, and perhaps with little regard for the costs and benefits of projects, and the governance, the social environmental governance standards around them. And this is what I think has mostly led to projects that could be described as white elephants, or don't deliver on what they're supposed to do. So I'll end there.
Thanks very much, Lee, and thanks, Stella, for pulling in there as well. I think we might move to Stella now. So just to introduce Stella, Stella Hongjiang is a postdoctoral fellow at the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And she's also a fellow at the Columbia Harvard China and the World program. She also co-edits the People's Map of Global China and the Made in China journal. So Stella, if you'd like to go forward with your presentation. Thanks. Sorry, just before we do that, sorry. Stella, just before we go to your presentation, Lee had a video we wanted to show. Oh. So I'll just, sorry, the order of things got a little confused there with the blip. So Jess, if you'd like to share Lee's video.
The extraordinary thing is that many of these bikes are brand new, hardly used at all. Forget stock market bubbles and property bubbles, forget the .com bubble. This is one with wheels on. This is China's bike sharing bubble.
So Lee, could you just explain to us quickly why you wanted to share that video?
It's just a brilliant illustration of the problems of overcapacity in the Chinese economy. So this, not just with bikes, but with all basic industries in China, from concrete through to chemicals, you have overcapacity of something like 20 to 30%, because many companies are engaged in investing and over-investing and producing far too much capacity. And this is it's a fundamental flaw, structural flaw of the Chinese political economy that can't be resolved very easily. And that's what really gives the imperative to go out for a spatio-temporal fix, to expand the Chinese economy to go global.
Thanks, Lee. That's a really clear illustration, I think, to make that point. Okay, Stella, we're going to move back to you. So if you could like to share your presentation and begin. Thanks, Stella. Stella, if you can just unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, I always forgot. So yeah, thank you. I'm really happy to be here to share what I know about, my knowledge about China, global China, and the Belt and Road Initiative. I think Lee already gave an excellent analysis of the relationship between, Chinese companies and Chinese state and the political economy, the underlying dynamic of the Chinese political economy that's driving all these going out activities. And so if I have some slight disagreement with Lee, that would be how I think about BRI. Is it a strategy? I agree with Lee that it's not a strategy in terms of China's strategy to dominate the world geopolitically. But I think in some sense, the BRI is a strategy for China's domestic economic development. And it's because, as this we can see from this nightlight satellite image of China, only a small part of China has been lit up at night, showing that economic activity is very much concentrated on the eastern part of China along the coast. And the vast portion of China, of the Chinese territory, is relatively less developed. So there's a tremendous need for China to open up the opportunities for its regions in these inland areas where economic development is lagging behind the eastern coast. So I would say that BRI is, on the one hand, it is a diplomatic agenda with a view to reshape the global economic landscape, so that China wants to build more trade and investment ties with some part of the world where that could be beneficial for China's foreign policy needs, for example, with South Asia, with Middle East, Eastern Europe, things like that, in a way to really shift the power, the gravity of power in the global political economic order away from the US. But on the other hand, like I said, this domestic economic strategy is considered a launch pad for the subnational regions in China to build international linkages of their own, to diversify China's international linkages in terms of trade and investment with other parts of the world. And so there is some kind of blueprint. That blueprint is not for China dominating other parts of the world, but blueprint in terms of how different regions are supposed to hatch on this opportunity and to build new ties, open up new logistic networks, trade routes, things like that with other parts of the world. And so all provincial governments in China are supposed to make their plans that's matching the national plan in terms of how they're going to participate in the BRI. So I think that's from the domestic point of view. And the way I would characterize the BRI, really, I think is a general mobilization across all levels of the Chinese government. And that's why it's such a phenomenal event in the history of the Chinese political economy. So on the top level, you have the political leadership, who are doing the high-level diplomacy, the foreign trips by the Chinese leaders and top diplomats trying to convince other countries to participate in the BRI. So far, we have already 140 countries in the world that have signed some kind of agreement with China to participate in the BRI. So that's a top level. And the second level is from the technocratic point of view, which I think is very important, but I think tend to be overlooked in media reports and discussions about BRI, is these technocratic ministries and agencies in terms of trade, custom duties, technical standards. So these government agencies and ministries are reaching out to their counterparts in other parts of the world, trying to integrate their rules and regulations, harmonize their technical standards, so that all these the barriers for trade could be reduced. So in order to facilitate more economic exchanges between various parts of China and other parts of the world. And below that, then we come to the subnational governments. Like I said before, they were supposed to develop their own localized strategy to build new international linkages. And so that will involve a lot of subnational diplomacy, things like the friendship cities between Chinese cities and other cities in the world. And also some kind of just depending on their locations, their cultural endowments, they might choose to build ties with some parts of the world. For example, Ningxia, which is a autonomous region with a very sizable Muslim population in northwest China. It is tasked to build ties with Arab states. So it's been doing a lot of things in this regard to have trade and investment activities with Arab states. And below that would be what Lee was talking about, the companies who are seizing on this opportunity to go to overseas market and build their explore overseas markets. And some of them might have closer relationship with the state. Some of them might be building into the overall strategy of building connectivity infrastructure, and some of them might be just taking advantage of the new opportunities that have been opened up by all these higher level diplomatic activities. And also, besides the economic activities, we also have other social organizations, academic institutions, think tanks, even cultural and religious groups going to other countries, trying to build more so-called people-to-people exchange ties with other parts of China, of the world, because it's been recognized that China's there's the understanding between China and other parts of the world is really, really thin at a societal level. So that's the way how I would characterize BRI. It's really, if there's anything different from the previous going out activities, I think this is very active mobilization from top down. So many actors are taking part in this process. So just for some promotion, we at the Made in China Journal just had a special issue on the archaeology of the BRI that looks into the past, the previous activities that China has been engaging in, that which BRI builds on. So for people who are interested, please, you're welcome to go to our website. I want to also present some sets of data. I think already these show that the rapid rise of China's outward FDI. And so these are data from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. It shows that, in terms of China's FDI, outbound FDI stock, it's been rising up very quickly, but it happened before the BRI in 2013. But in recent years, China has become number 3 in terms of overall stock of FDI behind the US and Japan. And in terms of FDI flow, it actually became number 1 in 2020. But we might not see this number 1 position continues because China's overseas investment has been slowing down actually. And if we look at the regional distribution of China's outbound FDI, if we compare 2013 when the BRI was just announced in 2020, we could see that it's not that much change except Latin America, which seems to be become a much greater destination of China's FDI. But it's been largely driven by the tax havens, the BVI, the British Virgin Islands and Cayman Islands, especially Cayman Islands. That's been a very popular destination for Chinese IT companies. So they would register companies in these tax havens so that it's easier for them to move capital out of China. So this has been, so not that much substantial change in terms of the regional composition of China's outward FDI, except this the IT company going overseas, going to the tax havens in Latin America. And if we look at the sectors, as I said, IT has risen most significantly as a sector that's been sending out capital to the rest of the world. Also, manufacturing has also been risen quite quickly. Other traditional sectors such as mining has been slowing. The increase has not been as much as in the IT or manufacturing. And business services is the sector that shows, the international business linkages between Chinese companies and other companies in other parts of the world. So now it comes to the people's map of global China that I've been part of. So this is, let me just briefly introduce it. This is an open access collaborative platform for documenting Chinese overseas projects. So we collect information about Chinese overseas projects that involved any Chinese companies, either in the capacity of developer or in the capacity of contractor in any sector. But so far, I've mostly concentrated on these energy, extractive, transportation, logistic, industrial, real estate sectors. So the profiles are written by researchers or civil society organizations or journalists in some cases, and therefore from all continents actually. So we are trying to build this more bottom-up network of knowledge sharing to document the especially the social and environmental impact, the impact on the people, on the community of the Chinese projects. And so since our launch in April this year, we have so far built a database of 28 country profiles and 39 project profiles, and they're still growing. So I would invite everyone who are interested in tracking more details about Chinese overseas projects to visit our website. So I would like to come to this question that was posed to our panel. Are Chinese overseas investment different from Western transnational interests? I would make 2 points. One is that in terms of the lived experience of Chinese overseas experiments, the observed impacts on the ground. One thing that's come up, most common problem that's reflected in the project profiles that we see in the global, in the people's map of global China, is the problem of transparency and governance. It's usually, it's very common that there is complaint about, the Chinese companies, whatever projects they're involved in, they are very untransparent. They don't share information. They don't really talk to the community. It's very hard to engage with these companies. I think there are several reasons that contribute to this. One is that we have to remember that the Chinese companies, they're still latecomers to the international markets. The history of their going out is still relatively short. So especially in some sectors, such as the extractive sectors, they really are just really rush out and just to try to get assets. And sometimes they have to buy assets from Western investors. And so they really know very little about the rules and regulations in international markets. So it's a very steep learning curve for them. And secondly, they have very little understanding of what community engagement means. The most important reason, of course, is that they don't have to do it in China. In China, if the government has always been on the side of the companies. They work with the companies, whatever it involves to evict people from the land and things like that. All these things have been taken care by the government. So the companies really didn't need to do these things of community engagement. And that's why they really have very little understanding of this aspect. And the second point I want to make is that the particular political economy of China's overseas construction. One thing that might not be well known is that there's actually very fierce competition among the Chinese companies, state-owned companies in the construction contracts. So they compete with each other fiercely. And that's why they have often tried to lobby the Chinese government to support them in terms of finance, in terms of diplomatic support. And so it's usually this way, rather than the state providing finance to companies and direct them to certain projects. And lastly, many of these infrastructure projects are very politicized. One example would be the Budapest-Belgrade Railway, which the Hungarian government even legislate to classify all the information regarding this project. Of course, there's a lot of politics behind, and that's why we are observing these very strange, there's a lot of tension around Chinese projects overseas. So yeah, I would just stop here, and I would leave out more discussion to our Q&A section. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stella. That's really useful perspectives. Now, we've got a video from you as well. So Jess will show the video.
Each year in January, I return to my home in China. This was the last moment I can remember when life still felt normal. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Hospitals were overwhelmed.
最多的时候，我们记得刚刚封城那一天，一天电话量得有1万、1万4、5的样子。我的好多病人全部送到那了。
The official news report said that everything was under control.
没有发现明显的人传人的证据，
并未发现明显的人传人现象。
But people were dying on the streets.
The risk remains low.
There's very little threat here.
The media was staging interviews with doctors and nurses.
I started asking questions. How are we preparing for this? I was accused of causing hysteria and spreading rumors.
I knew immediately something was wrong.
有种人间炼狱的感觉。
We didn't know what to do.
The moment you open your mouth, you conceivably could become a target.
When the government is telling us where to look, they're also telling us where not to look.
Hospitals are warning them not to talk to the media.
凌晨1点多钟把他送走后就没看到他了。
It started out as a medical crisis. It has become a test of our form of government.
This is the reflection of a broken system that was already in the verge of death.
It's hard to picture how all of this might end. But I can clearly imagine how this could have begun differently.
We have to be united to fight this.
So Stella, that's a slightly different topic. So I'm interested to hear what made you choose that clip. Why did you want to share it with us?
Yeah, because this documentary, I think, first of all, it has some very rare footage of the filming in Wuhan, in hospitals, in people's homes, even in the funeral homes. So that just show what it was like in Wuhan during those really terrible moments. And also, I think it's just a nice juxtaposition of the Chinese and the US government's reaction to the COVID pandemic. And one particular scene that was very powerful was that there was a man in Wuhan whose father died because of COVID, and he risked his safety to speak to the filmmaker about what he saw in Wuhan. And he believed that it was the lack of freedom that cost so many lives in China. But on the one hand, the filmmaker was also showing the protests in the US, people who are protesting about mask and mandate and vaccine. And so I think it just, it posed a very powerful question of, what does freedom really mean? And the poster of the film actually was also very nice. It shows that two people, one a woman whose mouth was covered by the Chinese national flag. On the other hand, a male whose eyes were covered by the US national flag. So I think it's a nice metaphor of the kind of very puzzling situation, very confusing situation we are in nowadays.
Thanks, Dar. I think that's something we haven't touched on yet, that the context of all of this has changed quite dramatically in the last 2 years as the world has faced the pandemic, and that has had dramatic impacts on investments, on relations, and on people's lives. So I'd like to just hand over to Brian and Weldon first to give them an opportunity to comment on Stella and Lee's presentations on the BRI. So Brian, if you'd like to go first, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I thought both presentations were really great and very informative. So I think particularly in this time that some people would term a quote unquote new Cold War, Belt and Road Initiative is framed as though some kind of conspiracy by China to take over the world, etc. But there is agency and is both top down and is both bottom up in that sense. And I think it's kind of hard, I think for a lot of people to understand the relation of the two, that is simultaneously both and yet neither. You oftentimes only see the view of it as top down and just state directed and etc. And so I think that is quite interesting. And I think that's a very useful corrective to a lot of the discourses that are out there currently. Yeah, I guess that's primarily my comment.
Thanks, Brian. Weldon, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yes. Well, I think I would agree with Lee's emphasis on the relative incoherence of the Belt and Road Initiative, though of course there has been from the top an effort to provide some sort of political and ideological coherence to it. So that I fully agree with. The second thing that I would just like to point out is certainly, especially during the Trump era, there has been this ideological drive of China to sort of step into the vacuum that was vacated by the US, its inward turn under the Trump administration, to see itself as the key pusher of globalization. And I think a number of Xi's speeches, especially in Davos in 2017, that was the subtext, if not the quite openly the text. And some of these ideas coming out with the notion of connectivity being the new phase of globalization, and that China was in the lead when it comes to that. The third thing that I would just like to say here is I think we also need to put in context in terms of China's economic rise, that the biggest enabler of China's economic rise was the United States. That in fact, the US transnational corporations facing the crisis of profitability in the 70s, 80s, and 90s really took to China, an export of capital to China, as very much part of the solution of the crisis of profitability. And that was something that led to, in fact, from a very strong lobby in the US, very strong corporate lobby that was basically provided the push from Clinton to Bush to Obama, and that really put as a centerpiece of U.S. capital, the policy of U.S. capital, the importance of China as as a source of cheap labor and as a market, etc. And I think we cannot avoid the fact that it was the United States that really pushed to have China come into the World Trade Organization, the US being pushed by its transnational corporations. And I think this is fairly well documented, the very active corporate lobby. In fact, I think until Trump, Washington was pretty much, Washington's China policy was pretty much dominated by the TNCs. The last point is with respect to Stella's, not so much her presentation, but in terms of the video. The one thing that I would just like to sort of bring out there is the difference. Of course, there was a lot of propaganda here, but there was a big difference between China's response to COVID-19 after it sort of stabilized itself in terms of the vaccines, Sinovac and the other Chinese vaccine being really promoted in developing countries. Certainly here in the Philippines, the first vaccines came from China and they were free. And you've got to see this at a time when, in fact, the pharmaceuticals and up to now, they refuse to give the TRIPS waiver So just this big contrast between the kind of Chinese vaccine diplomacy, in which large numbers of vaccines were being provided for free, and here were the transnationals, refusing really, to have any tampering with their intellectual property rights. And up to now, I think we've just seen how in the World Trade Organization recent meetings, there's just no give in terms of any sort of loosening of this. So I just wanted to add that to sort of balance the picture a bit.
Thanks, Weldon. I think, yeah, that's an important point. Just before we go to the audience Q&A, Lee, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, let's go to the audience.
Okay, so in terms of questions, we've had quite a few questions. And I'd like to start with this one around the benefits of the BRI. So the audience member is asking about, has there been a real exploration of whether there are domestic benefits for Chinese companies from BRI projects, and how relevant is this idea of mutual benefit in the BRI? So who's benefiting within China? And also, is there mutual benefit for those involved in the projects? So I think Lee, we'll start with you, and then Stella.
Yeah, I think we've always got to disaggregate the states involved and talk about the specific societal interests that are benefiting from anything. I mean, not just the BRI, but literally everything. We too often talk about China or other states as if they're people and the single unitary actor, and they're not. So the primary beneficiaries of the BRI on the Chinese side are what I would call a cadre capitalist class, clustered around state-owned enterprises. They dominate outbound investment. They dominate even more so construction contracts in the BRI. The banks that are linked to these projects, some of them are commercial banks. And some of the companies going out are also provincial, locally owned state-owned enterprises, and the cadre capitalist networks around them are benefiting from this as well. So, as I say, this is a way of keeping the show on the road, really, because I would say that there is fundamental contradictions within the Chinese economy, where growth has slowed down substantially, rates of return have fallen below the cost of capital, there's serious profitability problems, and this outbound expansion is a way of keeping those kind of patronage networks and the kind of stuttering Chinese growth model on the road, which is in the wider interests of the CCP, obviously, as it seeks to maintain its legitimacy through producing economic growth and employment. There's also a considerable number of Chinese workers that go out and accompany Chinese companies overseas, and they benefit to a certain extent in terms of employment, but they're often treated very badly. And what's interesting is there's a lot of concern about Chinese workers, a kind of influx of Chinese workers, that they're kind of stealing locals' jobs. But quite often what the Chinese companies are able to do is negotiate a sort of state of exception, where they can essentially continue to use Chinese labor standards in other countries for their workers. And that's why they like to bring them along. So it's a kind of a bizarre kind of bringing the offshore onshore kind of phenomenon. So although there's some benefit to Chinese workers, they certainly don't benefit as much as the managers and owners of capital. And then on the recipient side, you've got to remember that a project cannot go ahead without the say-so of a recipient government. If it's a kind of big BRI project which is backed with sovereign debt. If it's purely private, then yes, of course, there's got to be various approvals and so on. But if it's about state-backed loans, the government has got to feel that there's some benefit. Now, sometimes this is supposed to be developmental benefit, and sometimes there is. I mean, there are Chinese projects that go well. They tend not to hit headlines. The ones that hit headlines are the ones that go badly, but there's a mixed record. And there is a massive infrastructure gap in the global south. There isn't the global north, quite frankly. But look at Britain's antiquated infrastructure. We have to look to Chinese and others to help us resolve these problems because we got out of that game a long time ago. So, China is filling a real need for developing countries, and all of the multilateral development banks, except the ADB to a certain extent, and the Japanese, kind of just got out of the infrastructure space years ago and spent their time on frankly useless good governance projects aimed at soft infrastructure. So China is filling a need. There's also a variety of benefits that recipient state elites get from participating in the BRI, and that could be bribes and kickbacks from the Chinese companies. They could direct projects to politically sensitive areas, for example, their home state, to boost their electoral gain. They can use it to fuel patronage networks on their side by inserting favored companies as implementers or partners in various joint ventures and that kind of thing. So there's usually a mix of motives going on, and a lot of developing country governments are not in a good position to really evaluate the expected rate of return on the investment. And that's why and sometimes those concerns and considerations are overwhelmed by the more pecuniary interests of certain officials or political interests. And I think sometimes also there's a sense that China will do all this for us, right? China knows what it's doing. China will design the good projects, they wouldn't do anything that won't be effective. And there's not enough due diligence on the recipient side. And that's why things go wrong. It's not because there's a deliberate attempt on the Chinese side to lure them into a debt trap. It's that you have these interests coming out of China intersecting with local interests in recipient states in ways that can be quite toxic. Sometimes they're productive and beneficial, but they're quite often toxic.
Thanks, Lee. Stella?
Yeah, I agree with everything Lee just said. I think this mutual benefit thing, win-win thing, of course, is the rhetoric, but I think there's also really strong belief in China that this is the win-win solution, because China, by necessity, needs to go out, needs to expand to the international markets to export its overcapacity, and China also sees the need for infrastructure in many countries. And the problem is really how these projects are implemented, how they're designed in a way, if they are really benefiting the local community, or if they are, is in a reasonable time frame, is it with reasonable costs, social costs and environmental costs. So these are the things. But interestingly, when we think about the Chinese company, I agree that the Chinese state-owned companies are those, the caged capitalists are the ones that benefit most. But if you talk to them personally, you probably get a feeling that they feel they are also trapped in this, because this thing is hard. These people work in remote countries. They spend years in overseas. They live in quite moderate, humble, living conditions, unlike usually in the Western expats, multinational companies, executives, they live in a more luxury lifestyle. For the Chinese engineers and managers of SOEs, their salaries are relatively low, and they tend to live in harsh conditions in overseas markets, and they feel that they are trapped in this situation, that they have to compete for more contracts, and they perhaps the only thing they know how to do it, only way they know how to do it is to bribe, to do these things, illicit, illegal ways of conducting business, because that's the only way they feel they would be able to survive. So they are also feeling very uncomfortable. So it seems, even though this rhetoric of win-win seems to work logically, but in reality, it seems like it's not the lived experience of anyone involved. So that's the ironic part of it.
Thanks, Stella. Okay, we've got one other question here specifically about the ocean components of the BRI. So this doesn't come up as much. So the question is, do you, Stella or Lee, have any reflections on the oceanic components of going out of BRI? So we know that Chinese companies hold a lot of exploration licenses for deep sea mining, Chinese fishing, these aspects of BRI, of that sort of capital expansion, the companies going out, but on the oceans rather than on the land. Is there anything either of you would like to add on that?
I think it's just important to emphasize that the investments that materialize under first of all, there is no official definition of BRI in China, whether something's a BRI investment or not. Sometimes the same investment can be regarded as yes, it is, or no, it isn't. There's no official database. But certainly outbound Chinese investment does not map onto the 6 corridors set out in the Chinese government's policy documents. And this shows that there's a great deal of autonomy and lack of coordination and oversight. So a lot of what your questioner talked about there cannot really be, is it BRI, is it not BRI? Probably isn't really. If you look at so-called maps of the BRI, remembering there is no official BRI, doesn't run through the Pacific. So how could deep sea mining in the Pacific have anything to do with the BRI? Well, in the end, BRI is as BRI does. There are various actors that want to do these things because it's profitable or beneficial for them. And they try to mobilize, they try to say, oh, we're doing BRI because that mobilizes political and financial support for them. So I think it's important to actually disaggregate rather than aggregate. To assume that everything that China is doing at sea must be part of the Maritime Silk Road, I think is a mistake. The massive expansion in China's international fishing fleet, for example, has got nothing to do with the BRI. It is the result of structural overcapacity in the Chinese fishing fleet, which successive Chinese central governments have been unable to repress because local governments have protected illegal fishing fleets, despite China signing up to international agreements and genuinely trying at the central level to suppress the number of ships. So, we must, I know it's kind of difficult and the answer is always, oh, it's more complex than you think. But I think when it comes to China, we must resist this tendency to aggregate and try to see a strategic logic and movement behind all these different things that Chinese entities are doing overseas, because often they're quite opportunistic and they're not necessarily under very strong central control and oversight.
Thanks, Lee. Stella, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, the maritime, if you're referring to the Maritime Silk Road, I think because of the Eastern coast was already more developed and they have already very much involved in international trade, so there's not so much a sense of game changer for the eastern part of China to engage in the maritime trade and investment activities. But in a way, I think there's still this overall vision that the eastern part of China, the eastern coast, are supposed to deepen their links with other parts in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, and also in a way able to also feed back to the inland. So integrate the sea route, the maritime-based trade with the land-based transportation links, so that there will be logistically there will be more viable opportunities for goods to be moved around. So that was part of the overall strategy. I don't know so much about the ocean in the offshore exploration, things like that. It probably isn't that much a priority because these things tend to be very costly and maybe not the most cost effective for China to gain access to resources if that's its consideration.
Okay, thanks, Stella and Lee. We did have other questions, but they were more interlinked with the geopolitical. So we're going to move our discussion forward and we'll come back to those questions when we get to the next part of the Q&A. So we're going to shift now to a bit closer. So we're going to look at Taiwan, at the Asia Pacific region, sorry, and geopolitics. So this is kind of the second half of our webinar today. So our first speaker is Brian Hioe. Brian is one of the founding editors of New Bloom, an online magazine covering activism and youth politics in Taiwan and the Asia Pacific. It was founded after the 2014 Sunflower Movement, which Brian was involved in. He's also a freelance journalist and translator. Over to you, Brian.
Everybody, thanks for the invite to be here, and thanks to the organizers and the other distinguished panelists today. So I'm going to start my screen sharing. Hopefully this works. I guess it is working. All right, so I guess we're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to talk today about Chinese military threats directed at Taiwan, which have been in the news lately, and also turn towards fears of economic co-optation, etc. I'll start with the geopolitical, but also talk a bit about the economic so as to connect the other presentations. So this is an example of what is released by the Taiwanese Ministry of National Defense after these air incursions. These air incursions occur into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone. This is not Taiwanese airspace, but it is the airspace in which planes usually identify themselves for security purposes. You can see the boundaries here. So there are some disinformation claims, for example, that it extends over China. It does because of historical regions going back to the Cold War, and that there were Taiwanese planes that went over China at that point in time. But the Taiwanese government only reports on the planes that are not over China. And you can see that a lot of the activity occurs from the southeast, southwest area. Sometimes you have them crossing the median line of the Taiwan Straits, which is this black line in the center. It is not a line extending forever in space. It is specifically a line of this length. Here is another image of a different day of these air incursions. And so this is something that has increased dramatically in the last several years. It occurs on a near daily basis at times. However, when it made headlines in recent times, it is specifically with regards to the time frame after October 1st, which was Chinese National Day. So between October 1st and October 5th, there were 150 warplanes that were deployed by China into the air defense identification zone of Taiwan. And so there was a total of 196 planes that month. Last month, November, saw 159 planes. And so sometimes this includes nuclear capable bombers that occurred 9 times last month. And Taiwan is obligated to respond with interceptions of its own fighter planes, basically flying up and confirming what the composition of these planes are, ordering them to identify themselves. And sometimes in air, there have been exchanges of profanity where Chinese pilots curse out the Taiwanese pilots, saying things like, well, Taiwan is part of China, etc. And so this is something that we usually find out afterwards from the military, mostly Taiwanese, that they will respond with the posts on their Twitter account or images of the flight paths that are taken, or you have information from civilian spotters, which I find quite important because it is quite important to have these people who are keeping track of this that are not just government actors. This allows for oversight over what the Taiwanese and the Chinese militaries are both saying. As you can see from the flight paths that were shown, these do not occur close enough to Taiwan that people can notice. I get that question sometimes, can you see these planes from Taipei, which I'm at and from? But that's not possible, they're farther away. But they're intended to send a signal to the Taiwanese military, but also to the Taiwanese people, in the sense that, well, trying to project this notion, we can take you anytime, in response to things such as US diplomatic visits, etc. I'm talking about that in a bit. But in the meantime, life goes on as usual. There's no panic buying in Taiwan, no panic about an imminent invasion, etc. The news quickly, this is a front page headline, make no mistake about that, but the news quickly shifts to celebrity gossip, dash cam footage, etc. Part of the reasons for this are thought to be that Taiwan has faced military threats from China for decades. I also think in many ways, China has not really constructed a narrative of progressing, developing, escalating threats, but just more repetitive threats that are somewhat monotonous in the news. And so what does survey data show us? Because I think this is quite important. This is the information from a study by the Brookings Institute. There is worry from both sides in Taiwan. I mean, particularly that both sides of the Taiwan Straits, Taiwan and China, would start a war. You see this on the left with this graph, the blue one. And there's awareness broadly that Chinese military activity has increased. You see this with the green pie chart. But then when asked if more worried about war than they were 6 months ago, only 30% of respondents said yes. Asked if they think Xi Jinping is likely or less likely to attack Taiwan than 5 years ago, 46% said it's more likely, while 45% said the probability has not changed. And so I think what is interesting about this is it shows that Taiwanese are aware of these military threats, but they do not believe the threat is imminent. And so what are the reasons for this? I think this is important to note because first of all, a lot of this discussion of Taiwan in international media by Western actors in Western media discourse, etc., leaves out what Taiwanese think. But then it's also interesting to look at what China's capacities are currently. China currently lacks what is termed lift capacity to carry out invasion. Put simply, it is having enough capacity to bring troops over by boats or other means to conduct a long-term occupation. That is something China's working on. It's not that it just doesn't have this currently. It's building capacity, figuring out ways to launch staged invasions so it can get around this issue. But I think the more significant issue is that just China would have to shrug off the human loss of life. That would be enormous. Some estimates are that this would be a D-Day style invasion. You would be losing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. You would have to potentially put down armed resistance in Taiwan. There's a military draft for all men. And so in theory, that means all members of the male population know how to use firearms. Whether that's true or not is a different question entirely. The quality of training is sometimes not very good. People fire very little arms, actually. But then in theory, you have to put this down. China has not fought a war in 40 years. I think also significantly that China would have to shrug off the economic blow that the Taiwanese economy is large enough in itself that this would create global economic impact. The Chinese economy is deeply integrated with Taiwan through supply chains. But I think what happens then, particularly in the news discourse, is that you see both the US and China military officials on both sides talking up this threat to justify their budgets, their raison d'etre, their reason for existing. I think the conditions are right. If they are right, China might be willing to do that, but otherwise to do so is irrational politically. And so looking at this pattern of cross-strait economic integration, oftentimes the framing is very unnuanced, that China is simply bigger than Taiwan, Taiwan is small, and so Taiwan has no choice but to acquiesce to China, or etc., or that this is a way for China to influence Taiwan economically, and certainly that is so. But economic relations go two ways. China is itself reliant on Taiwanese semiconductors, which Taiwan produces more than half the world's semiconductors. It is the world is very dependent on Taiwan in this sense, and these are used in anything from the missiles pointed at Taiwan to your iPhone to your PlayStation to your electric car, etc. And it's not like oil, for example. If China were to attack Taiwan, you would want to preserve know-how and infrastructure. You cannot just destroy these foundries for semiconductors and expect to be able to still use this. The human staff that runs these foundries is also something you want to avoid killing off through an invasion that might lead to a significant loss of life. And so China would like to take Taiwan with minimal disruption to society. And I think this is also important to keep in mind. Apart from the human cost that might lead to a crisis of political legitimacy, you ideally do want to take Taiwan without disrupting society. And so psychological warfare then is important. That's why you do have these air incursions, for example. This can be seen as a form of intimidation. Other ways are electoral. Taiwan is a formerly authoritarian country. The KMT, which fled to Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War, ruled over Taiwan for decades in the one-party rule, once the longest martial law period in the world. But now things have changed with the rise of China, politically and economically. It is now the pro-unification party, despite the fact that it was once at loggerheads with the CCP. And so now it acts as China's proxy force in Taiwan, and China backing the KMT then is a way in which it thinks that maybe this is a way to take Taiwan without losing human lives, without conducting a military invasion, etc. And so, for example, one way to do that is by claiming the KMT is the only political party able to maintain stable cross-strait relations, claiming that the DPP, the party that emerged from the Taiwanese democracy movement and is historically pro-independence and is currently in power, will cause these provocations from China, that is provoking China, and will lead to these air incursions. Then you also claim that the attempt from China comes to claim that, for example, if the KMT is in power, Taiwan will benefit economically, attempting to pass free trade agreements, for example, such as ECFA or the CSSTA. Particularly when it comes to elections too, there's concerns about the use of disinformation to prop up KMT candidates. And it's also the case that Taiwanese media companies, particularly in the years of 2012 to 2014, there's concerns about them being bought up by Taiwanese capitalists who are pro-China. And so when it comes to economic players within Taiwan, China is the bigger market. You do have a kind of class of, let's say, cross-strait elites, wealthy elites, company owners, etc., who want to see economic integration between Taiwan and China, political integration as well, because they believe that this will be the way for them to benefit. And China in itself then tries to kind of conduct both a velvet glove and iron fist approach. You offer incentives to Taiwanese businessmen to do business in China in the hope that they will become a political class that will push for closer political relations between Taiwan and China. You try to win over Taiwanese young people who are increasingly identify with China, have disfavorable views, identify with Taiwan, have disfavorable views of China, etc., and particularly try to win over young entrepreneurs, people running startups, etc., in the tech industry, in order to kind of push for this closer relation. And so the military threats are the iron fist, and the economic promises are the velvet glove in that sense. But I think also what's interesting is that, particularly after the Trump administration, you see the strengthening of US-Taiwan ties. The Trump administration did this to hit back at China sometimes, escalating US-Taiwan ties for that reason. But the Biden administration has tried to distinguish itself by showing that this might be, for example, it plays a much more low-key approach to escalating relations, announcing, for example, diplomatic visits after the fact rather than before, and not trumpeting this loudly, whereas the Trump administration did that. But still, you do see this kind of escalation, and Taiwan is increasing relation with Taiwan as part of that. And so the diplomatic visits from the US are responded to by Chinese military threats. Sometimes you see threats directed at Taiwan because of something the US does. It's not always something that occurs only because of what occurs in Taiwan. And so in this sense, Taiwan is caught between the US and China. And regional fears of China are generally on the rise, and Taiwan doesn't really have a good way out of this map of actors. So again, as I would like to point out, just regarding this commonly discussed bugbear or specter of an invasion, it could happen one day. I don't rule that out, but the conditions have to be right. And just looking at the size of Taiwan's population or its economy, that it's the 18th largest economy by PPP, the population is comparable to Australia. This would cause severe global economic impact if you did have this invasion. Regional actors could potentially intervene as well. For example, Okinawa is geographically closer to Taiwan than to the Japanese archipelago, and there are US troops there. Japan itself would have to have some kind of response because of the Japanese population there, Okinawan population, etc. And so that's the question. But China's political leadership, if it is acting on irrational motives, such as manufacturing a crisis for a power expansion or power grab, something that, the specter of Xi Jinping doing that has been raised, that might be dangerous. And so it's really hard to know at what point we would arrive at such tensions. Xi Jinping, for example, as he is trying to expand power for a third term currently, it seems like a pretty bad idea to invade Taiwan. But that also does not mean that China will necessarily leave Taiwan alone if its red line, its bottom condition is met. The red line is always shifting. It's not always clear what the red line is. It sometimes is just whatever China says it is at the moment. What's interesting is that an invasion of Taiwan doesn't really benefit anybody. It leads to loss of life on all sides. It creates enormous economic impact. But it's hard to know what would negotiate China away from that. China's claims over Taiwan are historical in nature. They are not amorphous and eternal. There's all this claim about 5,000 years of unbroken history, etc. That's not actually true. I mean, even Mao said at some points that, well, we're not so interested in Taiwan currently. This is becoming accentuated, particularly, I think, because of the fact that with the rise of China economically, Taiwan offered a source of capital. And so you have this kind of attempt to build relations. And just in terms of economic interest in the region, for example, shipping routes around Taiwan, semiconductors, etc. That is something that maybe is one of the reasons why China became interested in Taiwan. But it's hard to know then what would lead to China kind of backing away from that. However, it does appear that this is not something that would occur in the short term, but is a long-term consideration. And I think what is kind of key to keep an eye on is particularly just what conditions could possibly lead to a Chinese invasion or could lead to China backing away from this. And so I think this is something to keep an eye on at the present. So I'll leave it at there. I think I'm looking forward to discussing with everybody in the Q&A and discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Brian. That's a perspective we don't often hear, as you say. So it's really good to hear that. And I encourage people to read the paper that I think was linked to in the chat that explored it a bit further. Now, Brian, you also had a video clip you'd like to share with us. So Jess, if you could share that.
Yeah.
So Brian, why did you want to share that clip with us?
Yeah, so I thought it would lighten the mood a bit. This is from a temple festival that occurred outside of my home. I live in Wanhua, which is the oldest district in Taipei and the most historic, also the most working class area. It's the first Han settlement in what became Taipei later on what is Taiwan land. So I think it shows a lot of these syncretic influences. That is a Japanese anime style car during a temple festival, and the gods are usually Chinese gods, etc. That car also emits flame. I did not capture that on camera, unfortunately. I thought that was quite funny. But what's interesting is, I mean, for example, it came up a bit in Sel's presentation that one of the attempts by China to outreach is on cultural means. And so particularly regarding Chinese influence in Taiwan, there's a lot of concern about non-government actors, cultural outreach, etc. And sometimes this occurs through religion. These gods, for example, at temples, well, they are originally from China. So for example, the largest religious pilgrimage in Taiwan, the Matsu pilgrimage, Matsu is a god from Fujian. And so then you have the attempt to conduct cross-strait exchanges. You'll have, let's say, a temple from Taiwan going to China with its Matsu statue, the god there, to China and with the mother temple, and basically doing this to signify Taiwan is being part of China. And so there's concerns about using religion as a way to try to influence the population in this sense. And also I think what's interesting is the religious culture is so syncretic, incorporates a lot of globalized influences. A lot of young people in temple festivals brought things they like, such as anime and electronic music and things like that, into the temples. But then you also hear sometimes the exchanges that occur. For example, there's a very bizarre electronic remix I heard one day of a Taiwanese like twee indie hipster song, and I could not find this song on the Taiwanese internet. What occurred to me is probably a Chinese remix that was produced somewhere in China and somehow ended up back in Taiwan through this temple festival. And so I think it shows the kind of linguistic, cultural, economic exchanges that occur at this level and how this dovetails sometimes with cross-strait politics. And also it's funny.
Thanks, Brian. It was indeed. Okay, we're going to move next to Weldon. So Weldon Bello is our next speaker. Sorry, Jess, I think our video is going in. So Weldon is an international, So Weldon Bello, he is an international adjunct professor of sociology at the State University of New York and co-chair of Focus on the Global South. He's currently running as a candidate for vice president of the Philippines. So thank you, Weldon, for taking time off the campaign trail to come and talk with us. He's the author of 25 books, including China and Imperial Power in the Image of the West and Paper Dragons, China and the Next Crash. So over to you, Weldon.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. And I'm very happy to participate in this forum, this webinar. And so let me just begin. And I'm going to just read my brief presentation here. I don't have a slide presentation. So at the beginning of the third decade of the 20th century, China was not only the world's second biggest economy, it had become the center of global capital accumulation, or in the popular image, the locomotive of the world economy, accounting for 28% of all growth worldwide in the 5 years from 2013 to 2018, more than twice the share of the United States, according to the International Monetary Fund. True, its growth rate was down to 6% from the blistering 10 to 12% rates in the 2000s. But that was far superior to the performance of the US economy that had been, for all intents and purposes, in the grip of stagnation for almost a decade following the 2008 Wall Street crisis. In 2020, China's economic recovery from the impact of the coronavirus pandemic earlier in the year made it the only major economy to register a positive growth rate. I have written about other aspects of the US-China rivalry elsewhere. What I would like to do here is to focus on the military aspects of the relationship. If there is one area where the United States still enjoys an overwhelming advantage over China, it is on the strategic front. In his speech at the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China on October 18, 2017, the famous Chinese Dream speech, Xi Jinping laid out a three-stage schedule for China's military modernization, ending at mid-century with the achievement of the military becoming world-class forces that could, quote, manage crisis and deter and win wars, unquote. One can read that assertion as Xi's admission that the People's Liberation Army was some 30 years behind the United States military, which is universally regarded as the world-class standard. Since the 1990s, the Pentagon has sounded warnings that China was set to become the US's strategic rival. Its concerns were, however, always placed secondary to the priority of Washington's political and business elites to integrate China into the global economy. With Trump's succession to power, however, China was defined not only as a competitor, but as an antagonistic competitor. As a landmark 2017 National Security Strategy paper put it, and I quote, 4 decades, US policy was rooted in the belief that support for China's rise and for its integration to the post-war international order would liberalize China. Contrary to our hopes, China expanded its power at the expense of the sovereignty of others. China gathers and exploits data on an unrivaled scale and spreads features of its authoritarian system, including corruption and the use of surveillance, unquote. As the US civilian elites engage in what has become unrestricted political warfare, making even a modicum of consensus impossible in most areas, there is one goal where both liberal and conservative elites coincide, indeed compete, to proclaim their adherence to, and that is to maintain the overwhelming military edge of the US state. So how do the US and China's armed forces compare today? Well, in 2019, US military expenditures were about 3 times more than China's, $732 billion to $261 billion. The rise in military spending by the US was 5.3% from its level in 2018, while that of China was 5.1%. US officials now routinely describe China as a near peer competitor, unquote. This is grossly inaccurate if we use non-partisan indicators. First of all, in terms of nuclear weapons, Beijing has a relatively small nuclear force that is guided by a no first use doctrine, NFU, focused on deterring a potential aggressor via the maintenance of a second strike retaliatory capability. The US has vastly superior nuclear capabilities, and it has not adopted an NFU position. China has only about 260 nuclear warheads, while at the end of 2017, the US nuclear arsenal contained approximately just under 1,400 deployed and approximately 4,000 stockpiled warheads. Second, China's conventional offensive capabilities are grossly inferior to that of the United States. Two key indicators of a country's offensive capability are its overseas bases and its aircraft carriers. China has only one overseas military base, and that is located in Djibouti off the Gulf of Aden, from which it participates in anti-piracy activities. The US has scores of military bases surrounding China, 25 major bases and 60 other facilities spread all over Japan, 15 bases in South Korea, 3 bases in Guam, and 5 bases in the Philippines. In terms of aircraft carriers, China has 2 operational carriers with an antiquated Soviet-era design, while the United States has 11 carrier task forces, one of them the 7th Fleet, based in Yokosuka, Japan, which can easily be supplemented by another carrier task force from the Eastern Pacific in the event of conflict. US carriers, like the recently commissioned USS Gerald Ford, are the state of the art, far in advance of anything China has to offer. Even the Pentagon does not dispute Beijing's strategic posture as quote-unquote strategic defense, which is rooted in a commitment not to initiate armed conflict, but to respond robustly if an adversary challenges China's national unity, territorial sovereignty, or interests, unquote. That comes from the Pentagon. The US strategic posture, on the other hand, is offensive. The two key elements are, first, forward deployment, that is to push the presence of US military power as far as possible from the territorial limits of the United States and as near as possible to the borders of a likely enemy. Second is a warfighting strategy called ARC doctrine, and a key document associated with this explicitly points to China as the enemy, and it calls for, quote, kinetic and non-kinetic, in other words, both explosive and electronic strikes against inland command centers, radar systems, and intelligence gathering facilities, raids against missile production and storage operations, and blinding operations against Chinese satellites. It also says that China's, quote, seaborne trade flows would be cut off with an eye towards exerting major stress on the Chinese economy and eventually internal stress, unquote. China's strategic dilemma is that large parts of the US military forces in the Western Pacific lie right on its doorstep, entrenched in bases on the so-called First Island chain, or at sea in the forward deployed US 7th Fleet. Most of China's industrial infrastructure and population are located in the country's southeastern and eastern coasts, and thus are very vulnerable to US power in the event of conflict. China's response to this dilemma has been to push its defenses outwards, placing anti-access, anti-denial weapons, A2AD, in maritime formations it seized in the South China Sea from the Philippines, such as Mischief Reef, or what we call Panganiban Reef, as well as in those it now occupies. These moves have been justified unilaterally by saying that 90% of the South China Sea belong to China. The infamous 9-dash line diktat. China's strategic concerns are understandable, but unfortunately, its claims and moves to enforce them are illegal and violate the rights of 5 other countries that border that body of water. To many in Southeast Asia, China is going about addressing its concerns in a manner reminiscent of the Western imperial powers. Now, be that as may, US-China jockeying for power in the South China Sea is creating a very explosive situation, since there are no rules of the game except an informal balance of power, and resulting to balance of power as a regulator of conflict is quite unreliable. as was seen in the case of the European balance of power that resulted in the First World War. Right now, US and Chinese ships are engaged in provocative games of chicken, in which jet fighters bust enemy ships, or warships head for their rivals, then swerve at the last minute. Having said that, it must be pointed out that despite the fact that it has been China's territorial moves that have grabbed media attention, the reality is that in strategic terms, the South China Sea has been an American lake since the end of the Second World War. The Seventh Fleet has never demobilized, and it conducts major cruises in the area almost every month. Recently, NATO naval units from the United Kingdom and France, as well as Australia, have been drawn by the United States to show the flag exercises in the South China Sea. With the increasing tension between Taiwan and China, it would not be surprising if an allied show of force in the Taiwan Straits were to take place in a manner similar to the Clinton administration's sending of 2 aircraft carriers there in 1995 to deliver a blunt warning to China amidst similar circumstances. Now, Clausewitz famously wrote that, quote, "War is the extension of politics by other means," unquote. This gives too much weight to rational calculus as the process of determining when to go to war. It grossly underestimates the role of passion. But what is truly dangerous when passion is joined to rational calculus, such as when the desire to maintain hegemony is attached to a calculable process of when to go to war. Xi Jinping's estimate at the 19th Congress that it will be in mid-century that China will have, quote unquote, class forces that can match those of the United States has perhaps unwittingly given the Pentagon a sense that it has at most a 30-year window of opportunity and most likely less to do something. Will the Pentagon really allow Beijing to achieve strategic equality, which may well be the last step to America's loss of global hegemony? Let me conclude by quoting Graham Allison, the Dean of the Security Studies Establishment of the United States, who says that China and the US are on a collision course for war, unless both parties take difficult and painful actions to avert it, unquote. To many, a preemptive move on the part of the United States, given its bellicose history, it's been the most warlike history on Earth for the last 245 years, is a very real possibility. It is our role as transnational civil society to prevent that and eventually to eliminate the conditions that give rise to this condition. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Weldon. Okay, so there's a lot in there. I think you actually answered a few of the questions that we'd received through your presentation. I'd like to just quickly give an opportunity for other panelists if there's anything they want to add. So Lee first.
I don't have much to add to those excellent presentations, except perhaps to add a slight point to what Brian had said about the idea of a cross-strait class interested in maintaining the status quo. I would simply add that this is also mirrored on the Chinese side. We have to remember that Taiwanese capital was crucial for China's reform and opening up, and Taiwanese capitalists are deeply embedded in the Chinese political economy. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, the central government was trying to put a great deal of pressure on Taiwan and insisted on economic sanctions being imposed essentially on Taiwan. And local governments close to Taiwan, which obviously are most deeply integrated into Taiwanese circuits of capital, essentially refused to implement these sanctions. And put pressure on the government to instead offer a package of economic incentives for closer ties with Taiwan, which then deepened the globalization process. So this is an interesting example of how this fragmented Chinese party state applies, even when it comes to something as apparently core and central to Chinese interests as Taiwan. Anyway, that's all. I just wanted to add a very small point on that.
Thanks, Lee. Stella, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, not for comments on the excellent presentations, but some of my own personal observation, because I'm from Fujian, just across straight from Taiwan. So I spent a lot of time actually in the past 2 years back in my hometown. And what I saw from, my interaction with people from Fujian, all these middle class people, they seem to believe that it's very easy for China to unify Taiwan by force. and they were even like jokingly looking forward to it. That puzzles me, because if there's any group of people in China that should be concerned about a war across the strait, that should be people from Fujian, because they will be on the front line. And just the fact that they are so oblivious to all the costs that will be associated with the war really worries me. So yeah, just my personal observation and anecdote.
Sorry, can I just add one very short extra comment, which is that there is a mirror to what Weldon is talking about when it comes to the risk of accidental war, and what Brian talked about in terms of the irrationality. You know, will the Chinese leadership behave rationally? We have to remember a very basic point, but it's important in this context, which is that the Chinese Communist Party relies on economic growth and nationalism as its main two legitimation planks. And it has massively ramped up nationalism under Xi Jinping. And the idea that China will eventually, unify Taiwan by hook or crook, I think produces that sort of rather blasé attitude towards war. And by kind of whipping up war fever, elites can get dragged along with that. We have plenty of examples of that in the dark past of Europe, for example. So it's a massive risk. Although the Chinese communist leadership is obviously to some extent autonomous from public opinion, there's always the risk that if the economic side of the legitimation starts to look shaky, some people saying that economic growth is closer to 2 or 3% rather than the claimed 5 or 6%. If that starts to look shaky, then there's a possibility of greater reliance on nationalism, and then Taiwan looks more in the firing line. It doesn't have to be about rational calculation. Elites do things for all kinds of reasons, mostly in the Chinese Communist Party's case, to stay in power.
Thanks, Lee. Okay, so we're going to come back to the questions. We'll come back in particular to Taiwan. But before we come back to the questions, we're just going to do a really quick survey. So we want to find out a little bit more about, if we were to go more into detail, have more webinars on this theme, how would you'd like that to look like? So Nick's going to put a link in the chat. If you can just quickly fill in a 2-second question, that'll help us to work out how to formulate webinars going forward, because we know there's been a lot of interest in this area, and we have there's a lot more people that we could that could also have something to share that would be really great. So we'd like to see how we could best move forward on that. So Nick, if you could put that in the chat. Sorry, Nick, I can't hear you. Okay, are we able to pull that up, Nick, or should we move it to the end? Sorry, I still can't hear you. I think we'll wait till the end.
We've got the poll, it's up currently. It's just you can't vote because you are the host.
Sorry,
so everyone else can see it. So fill it in. We'll just leave it up for just a sec. We've got our lovely attendees filling it in now. Give it just a minute. Yeah. Sorry for the confusion there, Steph.
Thanks, Jess. Sorry about that. I can't see it, but apparently you can all see a poll. Please fill in that poll.
Everyone can see it, unless you're on a mobile phone. And also if you're on an old version of Zoom, or like an outdated one, you may not see it as well. So don't freak out. If you can fill it in, if you can see it, that's great. If not, don't worry.
Okay, I think we can move forward. I think everyone's had a chance to chat about that. Okay, so let's come back to some audience questions. So first I'd like to come back to Taiwan. So there's a question about the right to self-determination. So Brian, if you could talk a bit about, I think what's interesting for us to hear is, as you say, we don't often hear the perspective of Taiwanese people themselves. It's always often through a lens of other media or other actors. So what the questioner is asking is, are Taiwanese people in favor of complete separation and recognition of Taiwan as an independent state. So maybe you could share a little bit more about, particularly, the right to self-determination.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what is interesting is that polling shows that Taiwanese majorities support the status quo, maintaining what it is now. The other thing is the DPP, the current ruling party, which is historically pro-independence. Under Tsai Ing-wen, she has backed away from being so overtly pro-independence and instead emphasized the position of maintaining the status quo. I think this is because Taiwanese people are pragmatic in the sense that they don't want to see war. And so for that to happen, that means not declaring independence, because that would provoke China. That would also provoke the US into suspending support for Taiwan, with the view that Taiwan is the one provoking cross-strait relations. This was the perception of Taiwan under Chen Shui-bian, who is the first DPP president, the first non-KMT, non-authoritarian president. And then in 2012, actually, the White House tried to sabotage Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, with the view that she would be another pro-independence politician in the same mold as Chen, through a phone call placed in the Financial Times, for example. And so despite this closer relation between the DPP under Tsai and the US, there's a history of the US also sabotaging Taiwan when it is viewed as necessary. And there's also low willingness to join the military or spend more money on the military budget, despite the threat of Taiwan. And this is also quite interesting. I think it also is tied to the fact that people don't just want to see war. They also perceive joining the military as not necessarily something that will stave off China, etc., and just really want to avoid that. And so that's why there's this kind of pro-status quo position. But you do have the framing of Tsai as though she is a pro-independence provocateur sometimes, and that is very misleading. And that is actually quite a dangerous view. This is what China is trying to push the narrative of in order to lead to a loss of support for Taiwan from these Western countries that are now backing Taiwan.
Thanks for that, Brian. Okay, we might look a bit broader now. There's been a lot of disputes in particularly the last kind of 12 months. And, we've seen trade wars, we've seen escalating tensions in the last few days, diplomatic boycotts of the Olympics. How can we understand these rising tensions between the US, Australia, UK with AUKUS, all these other actors and China, and yet we see still economic activity that goes on? How can we understand these escalating tensions while still so much continues on economically? We might start with Weldon.
Well, I think there's a real, split in the United States elite between, the Wall Street, Main Street, export of capital, importance of China market bit. I don't think that Trump was really able to completely, displace them. I feel that they continue to be very influential in terms of, U.S. policy towards China. And again, I would just like to say the biggest ally of China before the Trump administration was really the U.S. Corporate elite. And, the whole phenomenon of deindustrialization in the United States was very much, a lot of that was really, the obverse of that was rapid industrialization in China, a large part of which was financed by U.S. investment. So I think there's that split in the U.S. elite at this point in time. The second thing that I think we need to bring in here is that there's also the dynamics of the conflicts within the United States. As I mentioned earlier, you have an informal civil war in the United States at this point in time. I mean, I've just been there, and the polarization between the Trumpists and the Democrats is just very far advanced at this point in time. And I think the one thing that sort of keeps them ideologically together, or the one area where they are united in, is in the military containment of China. So they might be split on, things like continuing relations with China, on, the trade issues and that sort of thing. But with respect to maintaining strategic superiority over China, I think that's one thing in which both the far right and the Bidenites are quite united in at this point in time. And thirdly, I would come back to this, that and I would agree with Lee and with Brian that, if there's a threat of conflict that really is not on the Chinese side, that's principally on the US side. I mean, that's and that's not to be underestimated, because as China becomes more and more displaces the US more and more in terms of being the center of capital accumulation, I think that the US will use strategic superiority to try to sort of counter that. And we've got to look at this. The US has been at war, or until around August, was at war for 20 straight years in Afghanistan. And over the last 250 years, it's been the most warlike society on earth, from expansion to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the irrational warlike basis of US society cannot be underestimated, because it is a very central driving force, of US society since since the beginning of the United States and even before. And I think that's that fundamental irrationality is something that we must really be very wary of.
Thanks, Weldon. Stella, is there anything you'd like to add in terms of these rising escalation? What that means?
Yeah, that was already excellent points, and I guess from my point of view, I just feel as a Chinese now residing in the US, this frustration of, I mean, I see the possibility of a conversation, of a calm conversation between both sides is increasingly slim. Just both sides keep talking past each other. And there's very legitimate concern in the US about human rights violation in China, including the recent boycotts of the Winter Olympics and Peng Shuai. But I guess the majority in China wouldn't be able to realize what was the root of concern, what was the cause of the US hostility against China. In China, the perception is just about, US trying to stop China from rising. It's just the selfishness of keeping itself as number one, being jealous. It's very hard to really be able to have this conversation about what's the cause of a conflict. So I think in that sense, it's really, I'm quite pessimistic of where we are going, where we are heading to.
Thanks, Stella. Lee?
There's lots one can say. This is the big question of our time, isn't it? The new Cold War and why it's happening, whether there's any way back. I think it's important to say that China doesn't help itself. I mean, I think that the leadership of Xi Jinping has massively overreached. For many years, the slogan was, to bide our time, to hide one's light under a bushel, so to speak, and keep our heads down and keep quiet. And that's all changed really under Xi Jinping. China's throwing its weight around much more overtly and aggressively, and bullying smaller and weaker countries, sometimes very overtly. That doesn't go down very well. So, China does often behave quite thuggishly. I mean, it does tend to see itself as a victim. There's a kind of victim complex among the Chinese ruling elite. And there's lots of sort of ideological delusions on the Chinese side. The idea that everything China does is good, China couldn't possibly act like the Western powers because it was a victim of colonialism and so on, and a completely depoliticized view of development involving no possible contradictions or negative side effects. This is a consequence of the Chinese elite's own delusions and ideology, which are as powerful in China as the counterparts are on the US side. So I think that is part of it, that China has sort of given plenty of grist for the mill of those who are interested for their own reasons in a new Cold War with China. It seems to me that the American confrontation of China is something now structural. It's part of the deep contradictions and crises within America's own political economy. Weldon touched on this. I would characterize this more broadly as the end of history, the period where neoliberalism was this undisputed, taken for granted, hegemonic way of organizing society. That has been breaking down, particularly since 2016. In most of the advanced capitalist economies, there's a kind of blue-collar revolt against neoliberalism. And it is in the interests of the American ruling class, I think, in general, to externalize this revolt as much as possible in order to contain it and direct it. Obviously, China has played a role in globalization and the hollowing out of American industry, although it is American entrepreneurs who have taken the leading role and moving their exploitation of labor from the United States to China. But bashing China for its unfair trade practices, which do exist, there's no doubt about that. China is very much taking advantage of the liberal order for its own benefit and frequently cheating on its obligations. There's no doubt about that. Trump did have a point. But bashing China is much easier than engaging in the fundamental economic and political restructuring that will be required to instantiate a new kind of order that was more inclusive and more satisfactory for the forces that are revolting against neoliberalism. And I think, there's a desperate fear on the Democrat side of American politics that Trump or someone like him will return. And so they must respond to the blue-collar voters that defected from Obama to Trump in 2016. I think that is largely why there is continuity, that the Democrats have essentially adopted Trump's foreign policy. In the general context of the end of history is that Western elites don't really know what they're doing. They don't really have a kind of sense of meaning or purpose propelling their political activities. And so they grasp around for meaning, particularly in the international sphere. So, for years it was the war on terror. Now it's China that will give some kind of sense of meaning and moral purpose to Western powers. And I think that's one of the reasons why Western capitals kind of trail along behind the United States. They're also suffering similar revolts, but they're less easily externalized towards China. But most of the Western states essentially trail along in the wake of American foreign policy. They wait for America to signal, and then they generally move in a similar sort of direction. And I think that's broadly what's happening in the UK, for example. There's much less animus here towards China. It's not blamed directly for industrial hollowing out. But the British elite is very closely tied to Washington, DC, and basically trails in its wake. So I think there are some really big structural drivers of the confrontation with China, which are rooted in the contradictions of American capitalism itself. And that's why the investor class in the United States keeps doing business with China. At the same time, there is this political revolt. These things are going on at the same time because the Sino-US relationship is deeply contradictory.
Thanks, Lee. Brian, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that is quite challenging to deal with then, particularly because of the fact that there's not any easy way out of this conflict. And, these, I think, structural reasons are occurring. For example, in a lot of geopolitical circles, they talk about the quote unquote Thucydides trap, the fear of the dominant power of the rising power. And there is that. But then I think also, particularly, what is the model of a rising power now in the world? It is the US. And so I think particularly with China, you see convergent behavior in that sense. For example, the use of US war on terror rhetoric to justify the detention of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for example. And so I think that is quite a dangerous course to chart. But then I think then finding a way out of that is quite difficult at present. And so particularly there is a lot of outrage now, but again, it's always more easy for the elites on both the US and China side to divert that against each other rather than say the blue collar people, working class, kind of align and find their own shared interests, I guess.
Thanks, Brian. So that leads me to the final question. So I'm going to put one more question to all four of you. So given everything we've heard today, and I think there is a lot of daunting and difficult things that lie ahead, what does this mean for internationalist organizing and solidarity? So where can people who are involved in internationalist organizing and solidarity go from here? I might start with you, Brian.
Absolutely. So I think when we think about these, let's say, military threats between the US and China, both are caught in a pattern of tit for tat escalation in which one side does something, the other side does something in response, and it just keeps escalating. Both sides perceive themselves as only responding to the other, that they are not the first mover. Unfortunately, both sides think that, and so this will continue. But I think then what needs to be discussed particularly is the dangers of escalation on all sides. Having more popular discussion of what the cost, let's say, of an invasion of Taiwan would be economically, in terms of human life, etc., or of conflict between the US and China, because the easier it seems, or the more insignificant it seems, the easier it is for this just to become a real possibility. I think also a lot of the discussion is really confined to policymakers or in policy circles, and I just think that there needs to be much more public engagement, discussion of this on the left, etc., so that geopolitics and these kind of military affairs are not solely talked about by the right wing. And so I think panels like this and discussions like this are highly important at present to kind of really think and reflect on these issues and this complex relation of issues in which there are no solutions, geopolitics, economics, etc. It is something of a Gordian knot, and finding a way out is just, it's not so easy to unravel that, I think. So I'll close on that note, I guess.
Thanks, Brian. Weldon?
Well, I think just focusing a bit on the South China Sea, that in the Philippines we call it the West Philippine Sea, taking off from when I was in Congress, a resolution I made renaming the South China Sea the West Philippine Sea, but that's another story. But I think when I went to Vietnam back in 2014, the Vietnamese were really, really worried that you had things were so tense that a ship collision could escalate into a higher form of conflict, and because of the lack of any rules of the game. And I think those worries have now become more intense. And it does mean that we really need to find a way to bring some sort of rules in the area, which would then, move deeper into some sort of demilitarization and denuclearization of the South China Sea. And here, I think the key actors are of course China, and then there are the Association of Southeast Asian Countries, especially those that have border on the South China Sea, and then there's civil society in our around the region. And I think, some of us have outlined a plan, that would basically lead to demilitarization and denuclearization, hopefully. And after that, if tension eases there, then we could have a bigger discussion of exclusive economic zone questions and territorial claims. But my sense is that civil society around the region, supported by international civil society, has a very strong role to play there. And so I would say that there are possibilities at this point in time, but we really have to work hard in terms of moving away from this sort of unregulated kind of atmosphere right now that just, that just plays up to, a balance of power is always extremely unreliable as a mechanism of containing conflict. And that's why I think we really need to look at what's happening in the South China Sea, because this is the one area where the balance of power is, rules unconstrained by any multilateral rules of the game.
Thanks, Weldon. Stella?
Yeah, I think I was trying to think very hard about what constructive things I could say in response to the question. I couldn't come up with anything constructive. I just, from my point of view, I just very pessimistic when I look at civil society in China when you talk about international organizing, solidarity. So who would be the target in China that we should try this international solidarity with? I mean, the civil society in China has been decimated one by one. So I'm just very pessimistic in terms of how we are going to reactivate a sense of constructiveness in China in terms of engaging with the rest of the world, and try to come up with some solution, try to resist this downward sliding course. I don't have an answer really, but as an individual, I could only do what we are doing now, trying to discuss, have this discussion with people and try to communicate, raise awareness, and but I don't know, really don't know.
Thanks, Stella. I think it's a big question. I think it's a very big question in terms of what lies ahead. Lee, would you?
Yeah, I think the left or activists in general need to avoid two pitfalls. One pitfall is unthinking Sinophobia, which is not that common, but you do get it quite a lot on the anti-US left. When leftism has just become about anti-imperialism and anti-US, then there can be a tendency, I see it on the British left, for example, to basically defend China, against American imperialism, as if China is innocent and never does anything wrong, which is obviously completely absurd. And then on the other side, the other pitfall is obviously Sinophobia. Everything China does is bad. China's rise is bad. Everything that Chinese actors do in other countries is bad and must be planned in Beijing. And I also hear activists, grappling with Chinese projects, making those kinds of arguments, saying this is about Chinese imperialism, it's all carefully planned, etc. And so, it's a typical academic answer, but we need more subtlety. We need to look at this more closely and not to accept simplistic answers, right? This is not a morality tale. This is a really difficult, complex set of dynamics, and we need to disaggregate China. And I think I just want to post in the chat a link to the work of Inclusive Development International, because they do some fantastic work. And that's linked to some of the stuff that Stella's doing with the People's Map, for example, of really disaggregating China, looking to the different actors that are involved, and looking therefore for opportunities for lobbying, activism, holding actors to account, which actually is more of a hopeful response than just thinking, oh, there's just this monolithic block called China, which is rising and we can't do anything about it. And then just finally, I just wanted to pick up on the point about Taiwan, because this is where I think, activists and the left need to really distinguish themselves very, very carefully from the great power competition that is emerging around the rise of China. It's very easy to say, for example, hands off Taiwan, and say, China should not be invading Taiwan. I absolutely agree. But that can very easily be appropriated by the American state to say, yes, indeed, hands off Taiwan, and we will intervene to keep China's hands off Taiwan. So there's a real danger that as has happened through the 90s and 2000s with well-meaning human rights activists, for example, making criticisms of authoritarian regimes and human rights abuses in other countries, that essentially fuels the forever war, the need of the American state to be constantly intervening in the internal affairs of other countries. And that's something that the activists have fueled, I think, in the West in a rather unthinking way. So you need to think more, discuss more, and approach these things with a great deal more subtlety than they are being approached by our ruling elites, that's for sure.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks everyone. I mean, we've kind of ended on a somber note, but I think the key point is we need to understand more, we need to discuss more, we need to be mindful of the dynamics of what's going on, and also the impact of how we're talking and what we're talking about. So on that note, we're going to put up that poll again, because I think there was some confusion with the poll and we didn't put it up long enough. So Jess will put up the poll and just fill it in if you had problems with the last poll. So just to say that 5 is the positive. So if you want that, click 5, and 1 is the negative. So if you had troubles with the last poll, you didn't get to fill it in, please fill it in now. It's on your screen, though not for the panelists. So we'd very much like to thank our panelists today. I think it's been a great panel. We've had quite a diverse range of views and a very interesting, albeit somber discussion. And also thank you to the whole TNI team behind the webinar. So this webinar has been recorded and will be posted along with all the other webinars on TNI's YouTube channel. The link will be in the chat for you. We'd love to have your feedback on the session. So Nick's going to put into the chat also a link to a survey that you can fill in. It just takes 30 seconds to give us some feedback on this webinar, and we can use that to inform future webinars. So next week is the final session in this series, and it will be on China and the planetary environmental crisis. We'll be hearing from a great lineup of activists and researchers, including Tabitha Chow, who's an activist and founder of Justice is Global, Isabel Hilton, who is founder and senior advisor at China Dialogue, and Ying Chen from the New School, who has co-authored a book, Global Green New Deal, A Global South Perspective. So if you have any suggestions or proposals for improving the webinar or future events, please do email Nick at nick@tni.org. We'd love to hear your feedback and how we can improve future events. These webinars are free, so if you did find it useful and want TNI to do more of them in the future, please also make a donation via TNI's website to help us cover the costs of this associated with this webinar. So thank you all very much for joining, and we would like to see you all again soon next week. And thanks again to our panelists.